Good morning, everyone. It is Tuesday, April 27th, and this is our final virtual Iowa Quiltscape session for a while anyway. We do think that we'll be back, but we're going to take some time off during these warmer summer months when everybody is going to be spending, well, most everybody will be spending more time outdoors. Our guest today is Phyllis Schrag, and if you read my email and that doesn't sound familiar, it's because I mixed her up with a different Phyllis, and I'm so sorry. And Phyllis Zylstra, if you read that and were wondering what program you were giving for the Iowa Quilt Museum, sorry to have panicked you, but this is Phyllis Schrag, and she is a resident of Ames, Iowa, which is north of Winterset and Des Moines just a bit. Winterset, of course, being where we are located, the Iowa Quilt Museum. And she's a transplant to Iowa from South Dakota. And in South Dakota, she is a humanities scholar. And so Phyllis, just tell us a little bit more about yourself, will you, and what all of that means?
I'll be happy to do that. Now I want to screen share.
Okay.
Just before we get to that, though, I'm so delighted to be here. And I want you all to do this. We're going to give Megan a round of applause because she has kept us entertained during our COVID captivity. So that round of applause is well deserved. We're going to have so much fun today, and I'm very excited, Megan, to be here and to be your guest. I have a passion for quilting, and I'm assuming that you do too. So we're going to talk about me a little bit, and then we'll talk about Marie Webster and the Quilters Hall of Fame. So if we want to share now, I'll tell about myself for a few minutes.
By the way, Phyllis and I are sitting in the same room today. This is the first time we've done that. Phyllis is fully vaccinated. I am halfway there. And so we're just taking a little chance, but we're feeling pretty good. Screen share.
You teleported from
I did.
the museum all the way to my home. Good for you.
And then we're going to go to there. And I see what we want to see.
Okay, excellent. So I am a South Dakota humanities scholar. And as I was telling folks before we started, I am also a recovering teacher, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But I am available to speak at events in South Dakota, and I'm going back again in a week for a little tour of speaking, and I'll tell you some of those topics in a moment. But if you have a need for a speaker at an event, you can contact me at that information there. Notice that my email is Phyllis_Schrag. I have that in red so you can see it. And some of the topics that I have, I thought you might be interested in some history topics. And as you know, humanities scholars research topics and then prepare a speech or presentation on them. And one I thought you might like to know about is mentioning the unmentionables, which is the history of women's underwear. And then I have one that's a history of women's and men's hats, because I love to wear hats. I do one on the life and times of Annie Oakley, the Underground Railroad. And one I'm touring in South Dakota next week is Frances Perkins, A Powerful Influence. And she's the woman behind the New Deal. She didn't get credit for it, but she is that woman. And I do that in first person. Then for literary topics, I use the Iowa book Little Heathens to do a topic on home remedies. That's a Mildred Armstrong Kalish book. And for children, King of Little Things by Bill Lepp. If you need a program specifically for mothers on Mother's Day or something like that, this next one is a great one. It's called Mirror, Mirror on the Wall, I Am My Mother After All. And those things that come out of your mouth and you turn around and say, where's my mother? I don't remember saying that before. And because I grew up in a small town, I have 3 programs that really talk about small town life. If you have to grow up anyway, it might as well be in a small town. And a sequel to that is Baseball, Preachers, and Funerals, what I learned by keeping my mouth shut and my ears open. And people who know me say, is that possible? And then one that's good around Christmas time is, did Santa come to your town too? But to the right, you can see some topics that are quilt related. I do trunk shows. I do sessions on binding your quilt, on creating your own scrappy quilts, orphan blocks. There's a presentation called Modern Quilts from Ancient Mosaics, which is very interesting. And then which is those pesky scraps, they multiply when you're not looking. And I'm also available to do machine quilting classes on your sit-down machine. And in a moment, I'm going to show you a big quilt that I did on a sit-down machine. So here's my little business. And my name is Fabulous Phyllis because I was an English teacher for a while. And in a unit on alliteration, I had the students come up with alliterative nicknames for themselves. And you know that students will give you a nickname, whether you want it or not. And so they came up with this one and spelled it with the PH like my name, Fabulous Phyllis. And it's even on my license plate. So I have to drive like a good person wherever I go. When you've been married 48 years and you have everything and two of some things, your husband gives you a vanity plate. Well, I made my first quilt when I was 6 years old. And one of my friends, who was an auntie twice before she was ever born, came over to my house and whispered, I'm going to be auntie and we have to make a quilt. And so we cut up fabric and sewed it together. I think she actually finished hers. Before I move, I found that piece, never finished, but I found it. And now since we've moved and unpacked some things, I can't find it again. Otherwise, I'd have shown it to you. So I learned the art of hand quilting while my husband and I were farming in southeastern South Dakota on his family farm. And in that community, if you were any good at hand quilting, you had a busy social life. So they taught me how to hide my knot and how to rock and roll, use the rock and roll method where you put several stitches on a needle and then pull through rather than the stab and stick method. And at that time, we were raising little boys. It was very popular in the 70s for people to quilt. And I remember our little boys loved it when I had a frame up in the living room because they never had to pick up their toys. They could always just play. And you remember how children that are toddlers are sort of attached to your leg? Well, I was seated. And if they ever needed anything, they just came up and put their head on my chin. I mean, their chin on my leg, sorry. I'm sorry. Well, I had several old-fashioned quilting bees in my home, and my mother-in-law, gracious woman that she was, made me a wooden frame with C-clamps. And here you see the women in my community, good Mennonite women who taught me the art of hand quilting. And of course, while they had their heads down, they would tell things, joys of their lives, the funny thing their child or grandchild said, or the near accident that happened, or the sad pronouncement that someone has cancer. And all the while we were quilting, I thought that those stitches were stitched with tears of joy and tears of sorrow. And so a hand quilted quilt has all of that in it. And if you have a single needled hand quilted quilt, that has even more value. Of course, we had to create our own templates, and you remember doing that. We used cereal boxes to create them and cut them out. And we didn't have the wonderful marking utensils that we have today. So a lot of our quilts still show some pencil lines, and we had to make sure that we adjusted the design to fit the block. After we'd farmed for 10 years, we decided we had enough of farming and we moved into Sioux Falls, South Dakota in this over 100-year-old home, which had 5 bedrooms. And what I loved about that home, and I'm going to refer to it in a moment when we get to Marie Webster's home, is the 5 bedrooms, because I had quilts on every bed. In fact, I would layer them. So if you can see in the picture to the right, there are several quilts on top of each other, and I let them rest and recline there like I would want to do, rather than have them folded up and in a cedar chest, which is not a good idea. And actually, you should treat your quilts like you treat yourself. They like the same temperature you like. They like the same humidity you like. They like to sprawl out like you like to do. And I suggest you never, ever, for any length of time, have your quilts in a plastic bag, because that's just not good for them. Also, you've probably seen quilts at estate sales that have a permanent fold mark in them. So there are different ways to fold your quilts if you have to store them. Well, then I had a quilt for every holiday, and the picture on the right is one I'm going to refer to in a moment when we get to Marie Webster's home, because her stairwell is not too much different than ours was in South Dakota. And then every extended family member had at least 2 quilts and maybe more. And I borrowed this American Gothic picture because these are relatives of mine, and you can see how happy she is to get another quilt. So at family gatherings, that people would just turn another direction rather than have to accept or decline another quilt of mine. So I made bundles of t-shirt quilts. And then I had a commission for a quilt. This is for a 50-year-old woman. She's much older now, but her mom said, I've saved these t-shirts for her for all these years. She's very persnickety. So this quilt has to be a snapping, wonderful, creative quilt, or she will not use it and will not display it. So you can see the deep quilting that I did, McTavishing, some bubbles, all freehand. And I have spoken to this woman and she said it is a prize that her daughter gladly shows everybody. And this is the quilt I wanted to tell you was the one that got me to long arm quilting. You know, if you do hand quilting, you can't get very much done. So I learned to do sit down quilting at my domestic sewing machine. And this is the very last one I did. It was a commissioned work. The woman and her husband eloped to the Bahamas, and she wanted a keepsake quilt from her wedding dress and her husband's Hawaiian shirt. And so I put his shirt in the sashings, and I quilted hearts at her request, and palm trees and seashells and starfish. And at the bottom, I'm not sure if you can see it, but there's a double wedding ring with their initials on either side. And then at the top, their married initial S is used. And that was the very last one I did at my sit down. Ergonomically, it's really hard on you. And so then I started to go to a long arm machine, and I have reasonable rates, pretty rapid turnaround. And I do like to specialize in doing t-shirt quilts and memory quilts, start to finish, for people who want to save something of their childhood or their life or their deceased loved one. So now I quilt for others, and I consider myself a long arm machine quilting artist. And there I am with my husband, lovable Larry and fabulous Phyllis, the dynamic duo. And we actually met on stage, like we're musicians too. And we've been making beautiful music together with each other for 48 years, actually longer if you consider dating. I like to make scrap quilts, and I included this one because of the string quilts that were on display here. And if you have not seen the current exhibit, I urge you to come or do the virtual one. This is a beautiful exhibit that's here right now. But I like to make charity quilts. It helps me to get rid of scraps, and I can take some liberties, because there's no child or no adult who ever says when they're gifted a quilt, I hate this, I'm not going to use it. And I like to make them for schools. Our school in South Dakota that was closest to our church was a very poor school. And I spoke with the principal, who was a member at our church, and he said, oh, Phyllis, there are kids who don't even have a bed. So if we can give them something that's their own, they will be thrilled. And then he used it as an incentive and a kind of a reward, but also for people who wanted to have something. And here's a little boy who got to choose this colorful quilt, and I was happy for that. So now let's just take a moment to see if you have any questions or comments from what I said about me before we go into the presentation about Marie Webster.
So you can use the chat window if you like. I have lost, here's what I go. All right, you can use the chat window if you like, or right now you can just take a moment and unmute yourself and turn on your video if you want to add a comment or ask a question. I'm going to type in the web address real quick for the Iowa Quilt Museum. Phyllis referenced our virtual exhibit. If you are far away and not sure that you'll get here before June 6th, or if you're just not comfortable traveling yet, iowaquiltmuseum.org, and click on the section for a current exhibit, and you can find a link to our virtual exhibit. Of course, we'd love to have you in person, and this exhibit will be up through June 6th.
I'll just keep going. And if, are there any?
Somebody just unmuted themselves. Deb, did you want to add something?
Well, I just wanted to let you know that I'm Deb Devine, and I'm the past president of the Quilters Hall of Fame.
Oh, wonderful.
How delightful.
Marie Webster House.
I'm going to be bragging so much about you, you're going to be embarrassed.
Oh, no, no, no.
Well, thank you for that. And as you have questions or comments, please just put them in, and then Megan can interrupt me if you can. I don't know if it can be done.
Well, here's one quick one.
Yes.
What's your favorite technique for scrap quilts?
What I'm doing right now with scrap quilts, I will take my grandson's or granddaughter's t-shirt. And because I'm making these for other children, I will take whatever. So for example, I have one that has a dinosaur on it and it has orange and brown. So I'm taking all my oranges and browns and putting them together however they will go in squares. And I keep going around and around until I have one that's about 40 by maybe 50 or 52, because that's a good kid size. That's my favorite thing to do right now.
Cool. Pam Close, go ahead and unmute yourself. I see your hand is up.
I'm sorry, that was a mistake. I was just trying to read what was in the chat. I apologize.
Gotcha. Well, you found the raise your hand button. Good for you.
Good for you.
Deb, did you have more you wanted to add? Deb Devine? That must be a no. All right.
All right, so we're going to honor Marie Webster in the Quilters Hall of Fame, which is in Marion, Indiana. And the books and references and photographs that I'm using here in the quotes are used with permission from the Quilters Hall of Fame. Something didn't work. The host spotlighted your video. I don't know. That's a later thing. So here is the Quilters Hall of Fame. This is Marie Webster's home. And you can see the sign in the foreground for it. It's a National Historic Landmark and a beautiful home. This is very similar to the home in which we lived for those 30 years in South Dakota. So I was drawn to it from the get-go by just seeing the beautiful established home on the green, green grass. And when you go inside, you can see the beautiful hardwood floors and the hardwood woodwork. And then if you look where her stair steps are, that's so similar to what we had in South Dakota. And I think you have to do something else.
Do it again.
I don't know. Later.
There we go.
And you can see that the wall space is used to feature quilts, and they're so lovely. So we're going to take a little trip around. Oops, I'm not getting any action now again. What do I do? There. So Marie Webster is in her 50s when this story starts, and she wanted a new quilt for her bedroom. And so she dusted off her considerable sewing and quilt making skills and looked to her garden for inspiration and creativity. And from that, she decided to make an applique quilt with pastel pink roses, a pale green lattice, and a swag border. First, of course, she had made during her engagement a crazy quilt that looked something like this. And you know, crazy quilts put all sorts of fabric together with fancy stitches. She was an expert sewer and a needle worker, but she really had not made a quilt since that crazy quilt, which she made during her engagement. And it fit perfectly. That crazy quilt fit perfectly into her home. It was a perfect complement to that home at 926 South Washington. But here's a picture of her quilt. It's the pink rose quilt. And you can see that she has included that green lattice that sort of flows around the blocks. She has used a multicolor approach to her roses, so they appear to have depth. She has used a green, which in quilter language is called that green. It doesn't have a name, but that green was popular throughout quilting history, and it was almost always available at the dry goods stores. And it seems to me that she departed greatly from what had been calicos and that sort of thing before. Well, the Ladies' Home Journal was the magazine of the era, and her friends convinced her that she had to send her pink rose quilt to the Ladies' Home Journal, which she did. Now that January 1st of 1911 issue features 4 floral applique quilts, which were designed by Webster. And remember, she was a housewife at this time in her 50s who had really done needlework only for pleasure. She married a man named George Webster, and they had one son whom we're going to meet in a little while. And you can guess that she was an avid gardener just from the motifs that she uses in her quilts. Edward Bach is pictured here, and he was the editor at the time of the Ladies' Home Journal, and he commissioned Marie to create 3 more designs, which were to be featured in a color issue of the Ladies' Home Journal. And in addition to the pink rose one, the iris one, which you see before you now, was one that she designed. And it has departed, again, it has more of a pastel feel to it. The darks are dark and there's a contrast there, but it isn't all dark like some quilts had been up to that point. So lighter hues, stylish, open designs, and completely different from what had been previously done. She also had a snowflake quilt, and I believe the one at the left was her original. The one at the right is a replica. So people were making snowflake quilts and using two colors as quilts. They're beautiful quilts. And then there's the wind-blown tulip quilt, and you can see the greens there and the yellows, and there's movement in that design. And just think of the human hours that go into from the first thought about how to make a quilt to the last stitch. There's so many human hours in a quilt. And I noticed in the exhibit here at the Iowa Quilt Museum, there is a quilt called Windblown Tulips as well. It's not this one, but it's one similar to it. She also had poppies, which we all grow and enjoy, and they are interesting in the way she designed the quilt and laid it out, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. And then here's the one that is the premier picture of ivy or leaves, and it is the, what is that one called? It's a morning glory. Those are all morning glories. And in a moment, you're going to see a comparison of an older version to a modern version, and also how she designed them. And then here is a white dogwood quilt. And notice her scallops, dark green in the scallops, and then her dogwoods on point. And she has really designed a work of art in this. And of course, the perennial favorite, the sunflower. And notice how she sort of mitered her corners with the layout of her sunflowers. So by the time the 1912 issue came out, Marie Webster had a great deal of notoriety. People began to get in touch with her. And so the magazine said, wouldn't it be good if you would give us some smaller quilts? Because everybody needed to make a baby quilt, either for themselves, for the child that's coming up next, for a neighbor, for a grandchild. You know, babies came every 2 years, whether you planned them or not. And if you just look at genealogy, you'll see that's true. And it has something to do with the menses and the amount of time a baby was nursed. So if a baby was nursed till 9 or 10 months, the mother didn't ovulate, and then whampo, she got pregnant, and 9 months later, there's another baby. So here's one of the baby designs. It's called Pansies and Butterflies. And it is a wonderful quilt, very pastel, a lot of detail with the butterflies floating in the borders. And then there's this one called Sunbonnet Lassies, and I want you to pay close attention to the quilting because you can see she quilted a picket fence. And she likes to have her design be enjoyed from any direction. And it's my understanding that the stripes in the border are like slats in a fence, and that they come together in the corner like a checkerboard. And then she did this mostly blue and white quilt, and then applique daisies on it with yellow centers, a very pristine and beautiful quilt. Another one of the child quilts. Now we're going back to that morning glory idea, and here is a full picture of her morning glory. And you can see that she has quilted it so that where the pillows are, you have a specific design floating across the pillows at the top, and then the rest of the body of the quilt shows the beautiful applique and hand quilting. Here is the inset of that, and you can see that it's very closely hand quilted. Long armors would stipple in that background so it would pop, or they would create some kind of a design, an overall design that would make it pop. She liked feathers, as you can see, and then there's that cross hatching. I don't know this for sure, but I think most of the batting then was wool. It may have been cotton. If it was cotton, if it was wool, it might have been hand combed wool, or farmers provided it, because polyester did not come on the scene until way into the 40s. Here's a bedtime quilt, and this one was published in the August 1912 issue. And once again, She has her stars and the moon, and then you can view this quilt and the children from any side. Well, Marie's quilts were a hit with the Ladies' Home Journal readers, and they began to request patterns. So she had to design something that could be sent out. Now remember, there's a lot of math in quilts. And so she subdivided her blocks so that you can see how to put them together. And in order to keep up with the demand, her son Lawrence, who by now was a mechanical engineer, helped by making the blueprints. Now look at this. Here's the blueprint. And then she would sometimes have them pre-cut. It looks to me like on a design board or cardboard or something. And that's one way to do it. She added instructions, sometimes fabric swatches, full-size tissue paper placement guides, all for the low, low price of 50 cents. Now in today's money, that would be more like $13 or $14 or $15. But that was dear in those days because 50 cents just didn't grow on trees, as my dad used to say. So here's a son picture, Lawrence Burns Webster, and he became a real asset to her. So you will see here some of the swatches that she provided, and she provided some pre-cut fabric kits. And because her son was able to make blueprints, she was able to give blueprints of the patterns too. And you can see that in the picture to the left, some blueprints. And then you can see the tissue paper guide that is shown there. In the right, you can see the little box that someone stored their paper pieces in. And you can see some of the thread there as well. So her mail order business really took off. And her sister and two of her friends actually helped fill the orders. And the Practical Patchwork Company was an entrepreneurial success, but you know, it never left her home. It was her own cottage industry. So as the letters poured in, she kept filling those orders. Then there was a request for her to write a book. And this is the book, the first book on quilting history that I'm aware of. It was soon after her success in the Ladies' Home Journal that Doubleday, Page and Company hired her to write this first book on quilting. And so she researched and she wrote about how quilt making had originated in ancient Egypt. And you can see there's a new copy or a different copy of The History of Quilts and Patchwork in Europe, Egypt, and America by Marie Webster. Notice this. She researched how quilt making developed in the Middle Ages and in the Renaissance, the revival of learning. And you can see how closely this is quilted, and it almost looks like trapunto. But it may be that it is so closely hand quilted that those motifs pop. And that's how long armors do it too. So Webster explained in her book how important quilting is and was and will be to the American experience. And here you can see many hands make light work. So all those hands quilting, and in my experience in quilting with the good Mennonite women in southeastern South Dakota, there was just a little competition. So they never took my stitches out that I'm aware of, and I'm glad of that. But if you were a good quilter, you had a busy life. If you weren't, you could come over and serve tea. And the thing about this quilting business is that all those women loved quilting and they loved each other. She also included some techniques of working with fabric and preparing quilts that include like a hand cranked sewing machine before we had the electrical ones or the pedal ones that some people still quilt on. But she prepared a list of over 400 pattern names, and she provided over 50 photographs of quilts as illustrations to inspire people. So Quilts, Their Story and How to Make Them was published in 1915, and it was received with an overwhelming response. And so many letters came to her from quilt collectors and antique dealers and interior designers, not to mention the home quilters, that she started to get requests to speak. So when you go to the Quilters Hall of Fame, you'll see a life-size or almost life-size cardboard cutout of Marie in costume, because she liked to don this colonial gown and lecture about quilt history throughout the country. And she'd show some of her quilts, and often several of her friends would join her too, and they would wear costumes as well. So let's go into the Quilters Hall of Fame, and you can see today that this home, which was created earlier, but the actual Quilters Hall of Fame was established in 1979 just to celebrate Marie Webster's studio and her art form. And you can see some of her dresses or similar dresses hanging there, with a variety of family photographs on the mantle, as well as some artwork on the walls that relates to quilting. And often the Quilters Hall of Fame will feature another quilter and her display of quilts. And when I was there, it was Carolyn Maslumi's quilts. So for 3 days a week, and it may be more by now, visitors are welcome to tour the galleries on both the first and second floor, showing the quilt displays. Now, get in your mind that all the walls have these beautiful quilts. And this one that you're seeing to the right is very pastel, very light, very delicate, very feminine. Compare that to what had been done previously. Turkey red, that green, maybe some light colors, but they had to be practical and durable to sustain the wear and tear and the many washings that they had to go through. A joy forever, Marie Webster's quilts were so distinctive and so popular that 10 more designs were published in the next 3 years. Now, up until this time, the pioneer people would quilt things that they saw, like a wagon wheel, or maybe grandmother's fan, or maybe a Dresden plate, or of course the log cabin. Well, Marie really departed from that by creating from her life experience the flowers that she loved. And at one of the exhibits, Kathleen McClary, a curator then of textiles at the Indiana State Museum, was quoted as saying in the Indianapolis Star in February of 1990, "Quilts were not made in voids, they mirror their times." And that is so true. If you look at an array of quilts, you can pick out the ones that are from the 30s. You know the 40s and the 50s. You know the fabric from the 60s and 70s. And you also recognize the polyester that simply will not die. In fact, I swear that when they excavate our livelihood, they're going to find polyester pantsuits and styrofoam cups. That's what I predict. Well, here are some more books that Marie Webster had, and you can see several different covers of her quilts. And she was very popular. The work, she said, and this is a quote, "The work of the old-time quilters possesses artistic merit to a very high degree." And that is so true, from color, design, to the hand quilting. And in this book, Marie Webster's Garden of Quilts, you're going to see many beautiful quilts that are based on a garden theme. And this is the one I was telling you about earlier. This on the left is a more modern recreation of the quilt I was talking about. And then her quilt to the right is much more muted. So quilts are still absolutely beautiful. And there was a full color painting of a quilt called Morning Glories, which is what you're looking at. And it shows the many beautiful and delicate varieties that were chosen for this quilt. And when you think about the vines that sort of flow through there, you get the idea of how it manifests itself in her brain. Here's a kid's quilt version of Morning Glories. And this one is done in blue and white. I think it's sort of faded where the vine is, but it's still very beautiful. And you can see that she quilted in a wreath of feathers and then some cross hatching with some movement in the border. And here is again the applique templates that were created and mailed to those who purchased a pattern. But then how do you just go about getting those graceful vines and beautiful hand quilting? Well, I'm going to show you in a moment how she proposed doing that. And I want you to look closely at this one. You can see that she quilted around the applique and not in it. And we long armors ask our customers, do you want us to quilt in the applique or go around it? Because it does make a difference on how the quilt is perceived and what it looks like. So here is this full picture, and it has pastel colorations and motifs that the artist's homage is paid. And it was very decorative, and it sort of reflects trends in the decorative arts movement, the colonial revival, and the arts and crafts movement. So here's one that makes you think it's a whole cloth quilt, but at first glance, you're going to see that it is different than that when I show you this pattern. So you can still order some cross stitching and applique kits that come in blocks with little blue dots on them that show you where to sew each block together. That was not her experience, but she did create them in blocks, and you can see where my arrow is to the left that one of the running vines there would fit into that space. So that would be a separate block. But if you look at the one inside of it, that is a separate block, which is alternated with the next block. But then she shows you how to do your corners. And she had one pattern which you would reverse or mirror for the top corners and the bottom corners. And that's her third block. So we do a little bit of that today when we are doing those hack and whack or whatever they're called. And we do put a mirror up to say, if we cut it this way, we will be able to get this design. And I think there's something in posies too. There's a pattern called posy blocks or something like that, where you cut up a broad piece of fabric and sew it back together and you get a different design. So one of the innovations of her design was the use of the medallion quilt. And that's a layout that is different than the traditional one that I showed you earlier. These are pink dogwoods. And I want you to notice that she made every effort to put a basket in each corner, and that her inside has floating dogwoods that are in triangle-like form. And then she has her braid of a vine of dogwoods on the outside and scalloped borders, very beautiful. And this medallion style had not been popular since the early 19th century. And here is an almost faded version of poppies. I'm going to show you a better version later. But poppies were such a wonderful springtime flower and so vibrant and sassy. They're just a wonderful flower. And here is her dogwood. This comes from a book. This one is more green and light. Often two color quilts, although she did use a solid dark to enhance the beauty of this quilt. And then here is that tulip quilt. And this one, you can see she quilted in the applique. So that's a little bit different. It gives altogether different look. You can see that she, once again, liked the border to have feathers in it that sort of swirled. And her tulips are lavender and green, altogether different departure. It has a lot of movement. And if you get to the Iowa Quilt Museum, you will see the Bluebells quilt that looks so much like this in its design and in its effect. This one, called the Cherokee Rose, was from 1916 or thereabouts. And this was considered innovative in that it was on point and that the flowers follow that on point design. And then you can see that it's almost like there's a bush growing around the edges, and that's darker. And she has paid special attention to how to do the corners. And then if you look at the very edge, it looks like it's sort of cut out. And then she had to do some bias binding, I'm sure, to get that. And I think that's the end of the quilt. I don't think it was appliqued to that tan that you see in the back, but I'm not sure about that because I can't tell by the picture. But it's a gorgeous layout. And here are those sunflowers again, which are very attractive. And she used that double border of a kind of a meandering design on her border. All the human hours are just amazing in this. But look at the quilt close up. All of that hand quilting. And because the quilt bats were not scrimmed like we have today, it was important that they be quilted very closely together. And now when we buy batting, it will tell you that you can quilt it 6 inches apart or 4 inches apart, or however you choose to do it. But in those days, the closer the quilting, the more durable it was. And I love this one as well. These are tulips, and she has used 2 different colors of yellow. So you can see in the top and bottom swag, and the side swags, a little darker yellow, and then a lighter yellow. And she has pulled those 2 colors into her tulips. So some of them are darker yellow, some of them are lighter yellow. But look at the energy and movement in that quilt. And it's all designed from her brain. She did not purchase a pattern. She did not have available to her YouTube or Amazon or the internet. She had to create it. And I am marveling at her creativity. Now, this one is a brighter, closer version of those poppies. And if you look closely, it almost looks like the red may have bled. And we as quilters know to be cautious about red. And if you need to put red into a quilt, and I encourage you to because it really sparks up a quilt. But if you need to, be sure you test it for color fastness. And recently I gave a bath to, actually it was blue, it wasn't red, and it bled and it bled and it bled. And there are products on the market that can help you with that process. But you don't want to put all those human hours in a quilt only to have it be ruined by bleeding. And here's one that was done modernly, and it is machine quilted within an inch of its life because you can. And that's one of the fun things about quilting, because I quilt for others. I say, how closely do you like it quilted? Do you want me to quilt it to death, or do you just want it to stick together? And so we have a little interview every time I do quilting for others. But look at the energy and beauty of these intense colors in this modern version. And here is her rose quilt again. And it's you can see the way she has put that together. I wanted to refer to it again, but now I'm going to move to baskets. And she liked the American Beauty Rose. And here's an American Beauty Rose. Well, they're in those baskets. And then if you look to the right, there's a blue one. And of course, those basket handles probably had to be cut on the bias so they would fold in nicely. And then I think there's a little reverse applique going on there in the slats of the basket. And notice that bubblegum pink in the quilt to the left, still a very popular. And here's her, did I go back? I did, there. Now here's an inset of her American Beauty Rose. And you can see this one has a motif quilted in it. And instead of cross hatching, she just used those lines. And it's very closely quilted. So I don't know if she used the stab and stick method or if she was able to rock and roll, but it's a beautiful quilt. And I want you to notice the border. She took advantage of having a striped fabric for her border. And it really does set it off. And in a moment, you're going to see something else that looks like that in this one, the Poinsettia Quilt. This is from 1917. And you can see she has used that border fabric, mitered her corners, which is not an easy feat. And there are tools out there that will help you to do that. But hers are mitered perfectly. She has used that red as her binding, so it sort of pulls it all together. And then she used that black and white stripe to create the sashings for her on-point poinsettia. And notice too that the poinsettia ends at a half poinsettia at the edges of the quilt, and then also a fourth of it. And that takes some mathematical skill, which she clearly had. This one is called Cluster of Roses. And once again, there's cross hatching, 2 colors of pink. Pink, I think, was her favorite. Notice the rose buds and a beautiful, beautiful design. And needless to say, I might have said this, but I'll repeat it. When I gave that wedding dress quilt to the bride, I did so in a rod pocket. And I said, you may never sleep under this. And you can use it as a coverlet. And no children or pets can be on it, because we don't want ever to have to wash it. And of course, that fabric was not washable. Well, this fabric is washable, but you still would want to keep it in its pristine condition. And here we have the basket of roses. You can see a theme here where she likes baskets in the corner. And these baskets have a green, and you can see the cross hatching to show the weave of the basket. And then she has quilted in some wonderful feathers, swirly feathers, as well as circular feathers. And then there's a little kind of pinwheel swirl that you can see. So she had a variety of motifs from which to choose in her quilting. Then she went to a similar design, but she loves those dogwood shrubs. And I think they must grow well in Indiana. So you can see her dogwood quilt. This is from 1927. And her dogwoods now have two colors. There's the deep pink and the lighter pink. And this time of the year in Iowa and in South Dakota and many places, all of those blossoming trees are so beautiful. And where they have the apple in the pink blossom, and then there's another tree that has white blossoms alternating, it's absolutely breathtakingly beautiful. And we have to enjoy it because it's only temporary.
It lasts about 62 seconds.
It's true.
Yeah.
When the wind comes up, it looks like a snowstorm.
And now we're starting to get red buds, so we have those dark pink
Yes.
blossoms.
Oh, they are so beautiful. So at the museum, at least when I was there was this Magpie rose quilt under glass, which could show you how the approach was taken. So you can see some basting stitches were made there, probably a bias strip there where the green is. And we don't know, or they did not know, the maker or the date, but it's from a collection that was donated to the museum. And here you can see a little closer description of it. Somebody puts in a lot of hours, but notice how that black and white striped fabric really bounces energy into the basket and also to the edges. So my advice to you is to say that you should simply take risks with your quilts. Take risks and try something different. And I always say that if I didn't like it, I can always give it to somebody else and make them accept it. Of course, not with family members anymore, but. So I want to give good time and good thanks to Marie Webster for being one of our quilting foremothers. She was an amazing woman, and she clearly had a gift as a woman who created applique and put that with quilting techniques to create stunning and effective changes in quilting that we're still enjoying today. Now, when you think about the human hours that would go into a quilt like any of these that I'm going to, when you think about the human hours, now I understand that there are kits where you just buy the pre-cut and you adhese it with a hot iron. So it's way faster. And there are people out there, you can look on the website and find many examples of how to do a very fast one. It'll cost you something, but it's a way to get something done.
We pay for convenience.
We do.
Yes.
And some of you I know are doing handwork right now, and there are people who work for years on a quilt. And so once that quilt is completed, they really feel like they've accomplished something. And because I'm a recovering teacher, one of my friends said, you ought to choose a hobby where you can see a definite beginning and a definite end. And quilting, there is that. There's a beginning and an end. Whereas in teaching, I got the same level of student every fall. And I'd bring them to another level, and the next fall I'd get the same level and try to teach them something. So as a recovering teacher, and there may be others of you, you might have questions or comments that you want to make. So this would be a good time to do it. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Absolutely. So Deb Devine, I see you've unmuted yourself again. Do you want to turn on your video?
I'm not sure I can. I'm just on my iPad, so
Okay. That's fine.
sorry. I want to first thank Phyllis for this wonderful presentation. You did a great job. Where did you find some of those quilts? I haven't seen them. Are they at the Marie Webster house? As the past president of the place, you'd think I'd know every single stitch in the place.
Thank you. Because I'm a humanities scholar, I did have to dig. And I had to get some books on loan from the library. And you can do that. You can request books and they'll find them for you somewhere. And I understand that there was an exhibit about the time that we were in Indiana in a museum where you could actually photograph. I missed it. I missed it. I was too stupid and didn't look for it. But so I had to research, I had to look, and you can find some of them. If you just Google Marie Webster quilts, you can find some pictures, and some of them are public domain and you're able to use them. I have used mine with permission. So that would be my best direction for you, is to do the research. And scholars, humanities scholars are a weird lot. We like to look stuff up and spend time in libraries and get our nose all dusty with newsprint.
I too am a humanities scholar.
So you know what I'm talking about.
Exactly what you're talking about. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So Ronnie had asked about what's connecting the roses, and I think that was in reference to one of the very first quilts that you showed. Do you think we can go back to
Let's
that?
try. I don't know.
Okay, if strolling quickly makes you seasick, you want
Yeah,
to
look
close your
away.
eyes for just a minute or so.
Ooh, look at that. This is your review for the test tomorrow. Okay, that's too far. Is it that one?
Yes, I do think so. So I don't know I don't think we can zoom in on that because it's
No.
a PowerPoint, but
Yeah.
what can you describe to us what's connecting those roses? Is it just another bias strip?
It is a lighter green bias strip that is the lattice work.
Okay.
That's described as the lattice
Sure.
of the quilt. So I'm sure what she did was put those down first and then put the greenery and then put the largest petal of the pink on top and then the red. Look at how many layers of work that is.
So I'm not a gardener, but my mother is a fantastic gardener. And so I know climbing rows. So this is, reminds me of climbing rows because it would need a lattice on which to,
One other thing, sorry, Megan,
That's okay.
this is Deb again.
Yeah.
I do Marie Webster performances on occasion, or before COVID I did. I hopefully will still remember after that. So if anyone needs a Marie Webster cut to come visit, let me know.
And you do that in first person in costume?
Yes, I do.
That'd be fun. We should connect, Deb.
Okay.
Carmen has said that her late husband's grandmother did a Magpie Rose for the 1933 World's Fair, and it is at the International Quilt Museum, the other IQM. We had the nomenclature first, by the way, of IQM. Doesn't matter. And then the Artisan Robert James collection, which is fantastic. And Pauline is joining us from England. She's in the UK, so she can't get to us right now. But she's enjoying us this evening, several hours in front of us. And Pauline, if you haven't yet purchased a virtual walk through this exhibit, you may want to consider that. So here's just a thought that has occurred to me, and let's go ahead and stop your screen share.
Okay.
We think we're done.
I wanted to go back to something. When I was telling you about my house and the beds, I don't know if I mentioned this, but I didn't want you to put it in a plastic bag, but what I would do is rest my quilts on a bed and then I'd roll them up like a hot dog and put them under the bed when I had company.
Sure.
And then I would leave on top of the bed the quilt that I did not care if it got an accident from a child on it or if somebody got sick or somebody bled. So that's a tip for you. If you have the room to just rest your quilts on a bed and then periodically, trade them around and enjoy them.
And then you can roll them like a hot dog. Yes. Cool.
Love it.
There we go. Okay. So here's a thought that just occurred to me, and maybe this can spark conversation, or maybe I'll just throw it out there and let you ruminate on it a little bit. So I'm looking at these quilts, and as a person who has come to quilts pretty recently and is a younger set, I really appreciate, or I'm more drawn to more modern quilts, brighter colors, more vibrant designs. And so some of my peers may look at these quilts and say, oh, these are such granny quilts, because they're very indicative of their time period. But just imagine if we transplanted some of these wonderful quilters, Marie Webster in particular, transplanted her into this time and place. what she would come up with, the amazing things that she would do with quilting because she was so ingenious. A thought that occurred to me. I just had to share it with you. Dale Drake, the collections chair at the Quilters Hall of Fame and has appreciated our program. Much of the Quilters Hall of Fame collection is online, and you can reach the online collection from our website. Could you put that address in for us for the Quilters Hall of Fame? I think it is thequiltershalloffame.org, but I don't want to get it wrong. So let me just, because I know, oh no, it's quiltershalloffame.net. There it is. So I can just copy that here and paste that here. And now you can connect yourself with the Quilters Hall of Fame. And they do have a really nice website. You can also go back and look through former inductees into the Quilters Hall of Fame. Each year they do an inductee as well. And not to correct you per se, but when you were talking about the Quilters Hall of Fame, you said she in exhibits. And actually Jack Edson has an exhibit there last year. So in the quilting world, we have to be careful to use our inclusive language.
That is so true. That is so true. I agree.
And we do have some fantastic male quilters.
Yes, in fact, the last quilt that we exhibited from the Quilters Hall of Fame was in our man-made exhibit, and it was the Arnold Heggie Savage. Am I saying that correct, Deb?
Yeah.
The Arnold Savage collection. Yeah, this was wonderful.
He recently passed away, so we're
oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
Yes, we miss him greatly. He
sure.
was an incredible gentleman.
Yes, yes. So Barb Garrett, I see that you have unmuted yourself. Did you want to interject anything?
The current exhibit at the Quilters Hall of Fame, they did a YouTube of it, and it's about 30 minutes long, and they show each and every one of the quilts. One of the reasons I know is because one of my quilts is in that current exhibit.
Oh, wonderful.
Congratulations.
It was a project of the Florida Quilt Study Group, and you can read about it. But I also recommend, if you're interested in Quilters Hall of Fame, that you go to their Facebook page, because they do post a lot of information with a lot of connections to what they're talking about. It's a good page to belong to.
Wonderful. Good tips for everybody. And I see that we have a friend joining us from Sweden. Wonderful to have you here from Stockholm. And I know we've got people from all over the country. And gosh, it's just a little bit bittersweet to be saying goodbye to you all for a while, not forever, of course. We've had a pretty good string here of Tuesday programs. And there is a part of me that's looking forward to regaining a couple hours of my work week, but I really have quite enjoyed these presentations. And I'm very much, very thankful to you all who have been on our Tuesday programs. Phyllis, could you type in your email address and your website to the chat window? Do I have the chat pulled up for you? No, I don't. Let me do that. And you can just type right there. And while she's doing that, I will tell you about the quilt that has been behind Phyllis over her left shoulder. The one you've been seeing is called Desert Flower, and it's part of the collection right now that's on display. The entire collection right now that we have in our exhibit is from the New England Quilt Museum in Lowell, Massachusetts. And they are floral quilts, and they were curated for us by Pam Weeks. It's not often that we get an entire exhibit from one other museum. Much more often we gather quilts from private collectors or one or two from a museum, even the artists themselves if it's a contemporary exhibit. But this time we're working with them, and it's a beautiful display of floral and botanic quilts, much like Marie Webster's. There's a lot of similarities to be drawn there in those floral designs. So there's Phyllis's email contact. If anybody is not able to copy that down, of course, I would be happy to put you in touch with Phyllis. So
I haven't seen it yet.
You haven't seen it come through on the chat window yet?
No, not yet.
It's on mine.
Scroll down maybe. Sometimes I get caught and I have to scroll down a little bit. All right.
Okay.
Anything else from you, Phyllis, in closing?
I just am passionate about quilting, and I think you are too. And so I'm excited anytime anybody's doing anything with quilting. So Megan, you are to be congratulated for keeping us active and entertained and encouraged and taught during this COVID captivity. We thank you for that. And yes, you deserve a break. And I know you have many other irons in the fire too, because this isn't her only job. So she has lots of other things going on. But the upcoming event on June 5th,
Yeah.
let's talk about that a little bit.
Yes, 2 B's in her email. MediaCom BB. I can't remember what it stands for.
Broadcast band, I
There
think.
you go. Yeah, it's kind of a local internet provider. So
Could you,
thank you for
could
saying
you
that.
just spell that out for, I still haven't been able to get it on my
Oh,
screen.
sure. It's Phyllis, PHYLLIS _Schrag, SCHRAG at
Okay,
mediacombb.net.
great. Thank you.
Yeah. So June 5th, the Madison County Airing of the Quilts is our kind of connection between quilts and nature, quilts in our community. And so there will literally be hundreds of quilts on display in Madison County and Winterset that day from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. We display them on our covered bridges and our historic 1870s courthouse, our city park, which has a Victorian hedge maze, and all sorts of other wonderful locations. They will also be displayed on homes, in businesses. Tickets to that are $15 or $10 if you're an IQM member. And then the day will conclude with a fundraising dinner and auction, and that's an additional ticket as well. But we just look at it as a wonderful way to celebrate our beautiful and historic community, to celebrate quilting. In our exhibits here at the Quilt Museum, we don't display just Iowa quilters, even though we are the Iowa Quilt Museum. We display quilts from across the country. However, for the airing of the quilts, we focus specifically on the quilting talent that is right here in our great state. And that is a lot of talent right here in our state.
Yep.
In fact, Iowa has more quilt shops per capita than any other state in the country. And yes, Patty, it is just one day, Saturday, June 5th. We take them, we put them up in the morning, we take them down at night, and then we don't have to worry with what happens the next day. So.
And I know that sometimes there's been a plea out, for example, with the Iowa Quilt Guild for people to either put a quilt in it on loan or if they wanted to volunteer.
Yeah.
If that's the case, should they contact you or how should they work that?
Yeah, they can contact me. That's perfect. We are always looking for volunteers. I am still looking for a few more quilts this year. And what I'm looking for specifically is what would be considered a bed turning. So we have several beds that are freestanding that we put out along our courthouse lawn. And then we ask a quilter to display half a dozen or so quilts. And those are a bed turning. We provide disposable gloves for people. We protect them with a tent if necessary, if there's going to be moisture in the air. But that's a really great thing. And I've got 2 or 3 spots left for that as well.
And tell me, does the person who owns the quilt do the bed turning?
They do not need to be there all day long. We have volunteers with every quilt all day long. And if the person who loans the quilts is willing to be there for a shift, that's great, but they do not have to be there the whole 6 days. And by bed size, we mean twin to full, maybe a queen if it's on the small side, but definitely not kings because that's too big and they'll drag on the ground. Our beds are twin, or we have a couple of full-size beds as well. If you want more information about that, you can find it all on our website. There's a whole page dedicated to the Madison County airing of the quilts. And again, our website is Iowa, I have to say it as I type it, quiltmuseum.org. All right. So with that last little plug, I think it is time for us to close things up. Thank you again so much, everybody, for being here. Thank you to Phyllis for sharing a wonderful presentation to us about Iowa, about the Quilters Hall of Fame, and specifically Marie Webster and her wonderful contribution to the world of quilting, a contribution that has reached far and wide and long, and we don't even know the extent of it, of course. But thank you to you all, and we'll see you again sometime soon. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank
Have
you.
a great day.